feel very honoured actually to be in this famous old bookshop. I well remember the very first time I came through the doors in 1972 and bought In Search of the Miraculous, still one of my favourite books. Little did I realise then that I would be standing here tonight promoting a book of my own. As indeed 2 years earlier, and I'm going to ask you all now to stretch your imaginations a little bit and imagine that I am a youth of just 18. Now, I know that may be stretching your imaginations a little far, but I'd urge you to do that because I'm starting to have a Faculty X experience. I may be standing here in this bookshop in the summer of 2013 in the middle of London, but my 18-year-old self is lying in Exeter's Cathedral Yard, basking in the sun. I've just left school, I've got a couple of A-levels, I've got no idea as to what I should be doing with my life. So I'm just lying there in the sun, and suddenly it starts to rain. So I rush into a nearby bookshop, which happens to be, or it's happened to be, Pitt's bookshop, now alas no longer there. It's now unfortunately a Waterstones, but if you can imagine me standing in front of a spinner of books, I spin the books, it stops, and there in front of me is a large novel entitled Ritual in the Dark. It's got a very lurid cover of a mini-skirted girl with her legs sticking out from behind the dustbin, and a man in the background looking around, obviously departing from the scene. The author was Colin Wilson, now someone that I'd not actually heard of before. But I picked up the book, looked at the cover and thought, that looks good. Looked at the name of the author, Colin, well, he's got to be good. And then I saw the blurb which said it was a modern Jack the Ripper thriller. So I thought I'd give it a go. And I bought it and read it on the bus on the way home. And it's incredible, really, how a seemingly insignificant event like that can change one's whole life in such a profound way. Because due to that chance encounter, I eventually became Colin Wilson's bibliographer, a writer of critical assessments of his work, a collector of his work, and of course I got to meet Colin, and you know, one thing led to another. So, and incredibly, just 43 years later, I was asked by Valancourt Books to write a foreword to that novel, which has just been published. So, you know, strange things happen in this wonderful world of ours, ladies and gentlemen, strange things. The books in this remarkable bookshop are, in fact, testament to that. Well, anyway, enough of this reminiscing. I'm here tonight to promote this book. It's a student's guide to Colin Wilson's occult trilogy. That is to say, the 3 big books that he wrote on the occult, all of which have been reprinted quite recently by Watkins Publishing in very nice editions, and I'm sure they're on sale in this bookshop tonight for anyone who is unfortunate enough not to have read them. I am, of course, talking about The Occult, 1971, Mysteries, 1978, and Beyond the Occult, 1988. Now, these 3 books amounted to an incredible 1,600 pages on the subject, and spawned many other lesser works, too numerous to mention here, but listed entirely in this little student's guide. Now, this is part of a series of guides that I've written, am writing, or hope to write in the future on various aspects of Colin Wilson's work. Now, those of you who know Colin Wilson's work will know that he is essentially a philosopher, but he has written in a philosophical vein on many different subjects. My student's guide to his philosophy books, The Outsider Cycle, was published in 2009, and there are a couple of copies still left, and they're on sale here tonight for anyone who feels that they can't live without it. This is the second in the series. The third will come out next year. It's a guide to Colin Wilson's books on literature, what he called his existential criticism, and I'm currently working on a book on sex and sexuality in the work of Colin Wilson. Now, when his classic study, The Occult, was published in 1971, some critics, fans and scholars of his previous non-fiction, particularly The Outsider Cycle, in which he had created his new existentialism and established himself as a philosopher, were surprised. Others were downright horrified. It had seemed that after the terrible mauling that he'd received from the critics and the tabloid press in the late 1950s, his reputation was recovering somewhat and his career taking an upturn. Many thought that this step into the rather contentious unknown was a retrograde step, both mystifying and likely to be a disaster. Wilson, they felt, was merely jumping onto the occult bandwagon. When the book was suggested by Wilson, and he sought the advice of none other than the poet Robert Graves, asking him whether he should write it, he was told very firmly by Graves that he should not. But with a family to support, he spent far too much of the 1960s on the arduous American university literature trail, keeping him away from home for lengthy periods of time. This was to be his first commissioned work, a sign that he had finally arrived as a professional writer. The financial terms from his would-be publishers, Random House, a £4,000 advance, and remember this is 1969, were obviously too tempting, and so he went ahead with the project. Now, up until then, Wilson had always anticipated trends in literature rather than being one for jumping onto bandwagons. For example, he published with Pat Pittman in 1961 the Encyclopedia of Murder, a book which anticipated the boom in true crime by almost 20 years. His Strength to Dream, a book on literature and imagination, published in 1962, heralded the late 60s obsession with fantasy and science fiction literature. The late 60s also brought a surge in interest in all things mystical, and on this occasion Wilson was not altogether ahead of the game. The pioneers were without doubt Louis Powell's and Jacques Bergier, whose Morning of the Magicians had been a bestseller in France for several years. Now, his publishers clearly wanted Wilson to replicate its success in the English-speaking world, because his monumental study went on to become a bestseller and an inspiration to many who have read it. So, although he lost some readers by taking this seemingly unexpected and bold move into the occult, he gained many, many more. In fact, Wilson has always considered his serious occult books, that is to say the occult trilogy, to be a logical extension of his new existentialism, providing evidence that man possesses latent powers which, if tapped and harnessed, could lead to hugely expanded consciousness and potentially even an evolutionary leap. Now, in a lengthy introduction to the new Watkins edition of Beyond the Occult, published in 2008, he wrote, and I quote, "When the occult appeared in 1971, it soon became apparent that many people who had regarded me as a kind of a maverick existentialist now believed I had turned to more trivial topics and abandoned the rigour of my outsider books. To me, such a view was incomprehensible. It seemed obvious to me that if the paranormal was a reality, as I was increasingly convinced that it was, then any philosopher who refused to take it into account was merely closing his eyes." And in that same introduction, he described Beyond the Occult as his most important non-fiction book, a view that he still holds to this day. If I'd had more time, I would have gone on to say that although readers of his non-fiction were shocked at his turning away from, seemingly turning away from his philosophy into the occult, readers of his fiction certainly weren't, because occult occurrences occur throughout his fiction, right from Ritual in the Dark right up to the fiction that he's written today, Spider-World, indeed. So yes, you're right.
What is your opinion, knowing as well as you do his work, what's your opinion between the two Colin Wilson writers, the philosopher and the occult writer?
Well, for me, it was just a logical. I'll repeat the question. What's the connection really between his philosophy and his interest in the occult? Is that really what you're saying? Yes. Well, it's quite natural, because Wilson's main interest is in expansion of consciousness and how we can live more vital and appreciative lives. And that's basically what his philosophy is about. That is basically what interests him about the occult, the hidden parts of the mind that we can, in fact, utilize. Well, basically what I am doing is I'm going through Colin Wilson's work picking out, cherry picking if you like, what I consider to be the essential books. And you do have to cherry pick because he's written nearly 180 books, many of which will just fade away into oblivion, but you're left with a very, very strong skeleton of solid books. And what I'm doing is going through each one of those and writing a 3,000 to 5,000 word essay on each one, just to introduce these books to people who have not actually read them, and to get them interested in them. So as I said, I've done all of his philosophy books, his major philosophy books. That's my student's guide to his outsider cycle. I've now moved on to his occult books, his 3 big occult books, and I've done the books that he's written on literature. So it's a very sort of systematic progression, really, from one book to the other.
Earlier, about the Encyclopedia of Murder,
Yeah.
which I think came out in 1961,
Did, yeah.
which I remember reading pretty much at the time, but was too young to know what the critics said, because that is a book that's almost devoid of philosophy, isn't it? It's really just biographies of great killers.
Yeah.
So how was that received? Because surely that was a great leap away from his previous books about philosophy, far more than the occult was in some ways.
Yes.
And it was published with rather lurid sort of covers and was a sensationalist book.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, it was ahead of its time, very much ahead of its time, and it really shocked quite a lot of people, especially Daily Mail readers. Kenneth Alsop, I remember, wrote a long article about it for the Daily Mail, in which he didn't obviously rate it very highly, and he thought that Wilson was just, dashing it off. But the book actually does contain a fair bit of philosophy, because there is a section that was left out of The Outsider, called the Faust Outsider, which he appended to the book. So,
I hadn't read it since the early 60s. But what did the more intellectual critics think of it?
Well, as far as I can see, they didn't review it. The reviews that I've found are very much in the popular press, and they all took a very sort of high-minded view of it. It was a book that they didn't think that they should like, and that their readers should like. I think it got fairly short shrift, but I think it probably sold very well.
Colin, can I just say, doesn't that book have a long introduction where Colin spells out his existential position using crime and murder in the same way that, say, Dostoevsky does in Crime and Punishment and all of that. And yes. I know in the States, the late historian Jacques Barzin, who only died last year at the age of 107, he would have been a hero of Wilson's, because we know he liked long livers. He wrote Philosopher's Stone that deals with that idea. But he actually mentions that introduction in a book he wrote about, it was called Science and Society at the time. So just an idea that outside of here, outside of London, where Wilson's name is still pretty much poison, nobody really liked him. Over in the States, a really established mainstream historian was paying attention to what
that's interesting.
I mean, in fact, I think that introduction to the Encyclopedia of Modern Murder is one of the best short introductions to Colin's ideas, because he manages to pack it in.
Yes, I agree.
And
the missing section from
that's
from
it.
the outside
Okay,
as well.
so he used that as the introduction. I see.
The Faust Outsider, There's no hiding the fact that Colin Wilson uses his novels to put over his philosophical ideas. So yes, his novels are packed with ideas, and quite often he would write a novel and a work of non-fiction at the same time, basically to put his ideas into action.
Because I think he wrote Ritual in the Dark before he wrote The Outsider.
Oh,
It
yes.
was published afterwards, but
Oh.
he wrote it first.
Well, yes, he started Ritual in the Dark in 1949, in fact, and it went through many different editions before it actually was published in 1960. Yes, it went through many changes. If you want to read about that, actually, there's a very good website called londonfictions.com, and I've written a long essay about Ritual in the Dark for that website, and that goes through all the various stages that the novel went through. It's fascinating.